giant cowboy saw a settler pregnant woman sleeping, what he did the next day made the whole town cry. In a quiet, sun-drenched frontier town, life moved slowly. The small cluster of wooden cabins and dusty streets was surrounded by wide fields, rolling hills, and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pastures. The people here were used to hard work, long days, and the simple joys of life that could be found in a warm fire, a shared meal, or the laughter of neighbors. Among them lived a man who was known by everyone, but truly known by few. His name was Jedediah, though most just called him Jed. He was a man of unusual size, towering over anyone in the town, with shoulders broad as wagon wheels and hands strong enough to lift a full sack of grain with ease. Despite his size, Jed was quiet and gentle, rarely speaking more than was necessary, and always observing the world around him with thoughtful eyes. Jed had chosen a life somewhat apart from the town. He lived on the outskirts, in a small wooden cabin he had built himself. It was simple, sturdy, and warm, with a chimney that smoked constantly in the winter months, and a porch that overlooked the grazing fields. People often saw him riding along the dusty trails or helping neighbors move heavy objects, but he rarely stayed long for conversation. There was a calmness about him, a peaceful aura that drew some people toward him and intimidated others. Children, however, were never afraid. They would run alongside his horse, laughing and calling out, and Jed would bend low to toss them small gifts, an apple, a piece of bread, or sometimes a small carved wooden horse he had made in his free time. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jed rode past the town on his way back home. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the faint scent of wildflowers that still grew stubbornly along the edges of the trail. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Clara, moved steadily beneath him, her hooves making a soft thumping sound on the dirt road. As they passed the small cluster of cabins, Jed's eyes fell on a figure sitting quietly on the porch of one of the houses. It was Mary, a young woman who had lived in the town for only a few years. She was expecting her first child, and the last few months had been particularly hard. Her husband, Samuel, had gone on a trading expedition several days before, leaving her alone to manage the household and prepare for the coming birth. The porch on which she sat was bare, with only a thin blanket draped over her shoulders, but it was enough to protect her from the early evening chill. She was asleep, her head resting against the wooden railing, her hands gently holding her rounded belly. The sight stopped Jed in his tracks. He had seen many people in his time, and he had seen hard days, sickness, and struggle, but there was something striking about Mary. She seemed so small, so fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in her that was impossible to ignore. Jed's heart tightened as he noticed how exposed she was to the cold wind that whispered through the town. He shifted slightly in his saddle, feeling a sense of responsibility he could not explain. Though he had never spoken to her much, though they were not close, he felt a protective urge welling inside him. He watched as her chest rose and fell with each slow breath, and he realized how alone she truly was at that moment. Jed knew the town well. He knew that people had their own problems, their own struggles to deal with. Farmers worried about crops, shopkeepers worried about customers, and everyone worried about themselves and their families. But something about seeing Mary like this, alone and vulnerable, stirred something deeper in him. He had always believed in helping where he could, quietly and without expectation of reward. Now he felt that his help might be needed in a way that could not wait. The sun continued to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Jed's horse shifted under him, sensing his unease. He slowly dismounted and tied Clara to a post nearby, careful not to make a sound that might wake Mary. He walked a few steps closer, his large boots crunching softly on the dirt. He did not want to frighten her. He only wanted to make sure she was safe until she woke. He crouched a little to peer over the edge of the porch, his large frame strangely gentle as he leaned closer. Mary's face was peaceful in sleep, a small smile on her lips as if she were dreaming of something comforting. Jed breathed out slowly, trying to steady the nervous energy that had suddenly filled him. Jed spent a long time there, simply watching. He thought about the long winters, the harsh winds, and the many dangers that a young, pregnant woman could face alone in this rough land. He remembered other times in his life when someone had helped him quietly, without asking anything in return, and he knew that it was time for him to act in the same way. The thought of leaving her outside in the cold made his chest tighten. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was quiet, steady, and certain. As the evening deepened into twilight, Jed returned to his own cabin, but his mind remained on Mary. He thought about what he could do to help her. He had supplies, blankets, firewood, and food, enough to last a week if used carefully. He had tools to make small repairs or even build a temporary shelter if needed. He began planning silently, carefully, knowing that whatever he did would need to be done with respect and discretion. Mary did not need a spectacle. She needed safety, warmth, and the knowledge that she was not entirely alone in the world. That night, as the stars emerged one by one in the clear frontier sky, Jed could not sleep. He lay in his bed, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, thinking of Mary and the baby she carried. He knew that the next day would require action. He would have to move quietly, gather supplies, and approach the situation with care. But, for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet excitement, a sense of purpose that lifted his heart. The town was filled with ordinary people facing ordinary challenges, but Jed felt that this small act of kindness could make a lasting difference. He thought of the generations that would come after, of the story that might be told long after, and he felt the humble pride. Morning light eventually crept into Jed's cabin, painting the wooden walls in warm gold. He rose with the sun, resolved to take action. He dressed quickly, tying his boots and adjusting his hat, and then stepped outside. The town was waking slowly. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the low murmur of conversation floated from the market square. Jed's gaze returned to Mary's cabin just across the street. She was still asleep, unaware of the giant figure who had silently observed her the night before. Jed's heart swelled with determination. Today, he would make sure that she was safe. With that, Jed took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his size and the strength in his arms, and began his preparations. He gathered blankets, firewood, and food from his cabin, moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime handling heavy objects. Each step was deliberate, each movement gentle. As he considered how to provide comfort without startling her, he worked quietly, fully aware that this was not just about the material things he could bring, but about the care and attention that would show Mary she was not alone. By the time the first birds began to sing in the trees, Jed had gathered everything he needed. He paused for a moment, looking at the small cabin and the woman who had unknowingly touched his heart. He did not rush. He did not make a show of his plans. Instead, he reminded himself that kindness was often quiet and unnoticed, but it had power all the same. He stepped forward, ready to act, ready to bring warmth and safety to someone who had no idea that a giant cowboy had been watching over her through the long night. The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet town, spilling golden light over the dusty streets and the small wooden cabins that lined the way. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery drifted through the air, mixing with the earthy scent of livestock in the fields. For most of the town, It was another ordinary morning. Farmers were already heading to their fields. Children were helping their parents feed the chickens, and shopkeepers were sweeping the steps of their stores. But for Jedediah, the morning felt different. It carried a weight he could not ignore, and a responsibility he had chosen for himself. Mary was still asleep on her porch when Jed arrived, carrying bundles of blankets, firewood, and baskets filled with food. The early morning chill made the air crisp, and he could see his own breath curling in front of him as he moved quietly. His heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with purpose. Every step he took toward her cabin felt deliberate, as if the ground itself acknowledged the importance of what he was about to do. He did not hurry. He knew that rushing could create noise, and he wanted Mary to wake peacefully, without being startled. He laid the firewood near the porch, stacking it carefully so that it would be easy for her to reach if she woke. He then spread the thick blankets on the wooden steps, creating a small, warm area where she could sit safely. He placed the food nearby: bread, dried meat, fresh fruit, and a jar of milk. Simple things, but enough to sustain her until her husband returned. Jed looked over his work, adjusting the items with a meticulous care, and then stepped back, watching her from a distance. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Mary began to stir. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light, and she blinked at the sight of the blankets and firewood neatly arranged on her porch. She noticed the baskets of food first and sat up, a mixture of surprise and gratitude crossing her face.
"Who?" she whispered, her voice soft and uncertain.
She looked around but saw no one. Jed stood a short distance away, his large frame outlined against the morning light. He smiled gently, a warm, quiet smile that made her feel immediately safe. "Good morning, ma'am," Jed said in his low, calm voice. "I thought you might need some help." Mary's eyes widened slightly. She had heard of Jed, of course. Everyone in the town had. But she had never spoken to him directly. His reputation as a giant and a strong man preceded him, and while some people were intimidated, she felt only relief. Relief that someone cared enough to notice her alone and vulnerable. She nodded slowly, unable to find the right words at first. Jed did not move closer immediately. He remained at a respectful distance, giving her space. "You shouldn't be out here without help," he said gently. "It's cold and you're expecting. You need to rest and keep warm." Mary's hands instinctively went to her belly. I didn't want to trouble anyone," she admitted. Her voice trembled slightly. She had always been proud, independent, and determined not to rely on others, but the exhaustion of the past weeks had caught up to her. Her husband's absence had made everything more difficult, and she had struggled quietly, hoping no one would notice. Jed shook his head slowly. "No trouble at all," he said. "It's no trouble to make sure someone stays safe. You're not alone." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of sincerity that Mary could feel deep in her chest. She looked at him, searching his face, and saw nothing but genuine concern. The town had always whispered about Jed's strength and size, but here was a man who was strong in spirit too, someone whose heart matched his hands. Over the next few hours, Jed helped Mary organize her cabin. He brought in firewood, built a small stack near the stove, and arranged the blankets in the corner where she could sit and rest comfortably. He helped her prepare a simple meal, teaching her how to use some of the items he had brought in more effectively. Mary watched him carefully, amazed at the careful precision in everything he did. Every movement was deliberate, thoughtful, and full of care. He didn't rush, he didn't complain, and he didn't expect anything in return. By mid-morning, some neighbors had begun to notice the activity. Curious glances turned into whispers as they watched Jed, the quiet giant of the outskirts, working tirelessly to help a single woman. Some shook their heads in disbelief, muttering that it wasn't his business. Others paused and watched, their hearts touched by the simple kindness of his actions. No one spoke at first, but the presence of Jed's care was becoming impossible to ignore. Mary finally spoke after a moment of silence. Why are you doing all this?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a mix of gratitude and confusion. She had been raised to believe that help was something to be earned, not given freely, and Jed's actions felt almost too generous to be real. Jed knelt slightly to meet her eyes.
"Because it's the right thing," he said simply. "You shouldn't have to struggle alone when you don't have to."
"We all need help sometimes, and that's okay." Mary felt a lump form in her throat. She had never considered that someone might care so much without expecting anything in return. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting to appear weak. Instead, she focused on the warmth spreading in her chest, the relief that finally someone was watching over her and the baby she carried. The morning passed quietly, filled with the sound of Jed's careful movements, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. Mary began to relax, sitting wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm milk, and nibbling on bread as Jed continued his work. He repaired a loose board on the porch, adjusted a small fence outside to keep the animals from wandering too close, and made sure the fire was steady and warm. Everything he did was small, simple, but meaningful. As the day wore on, the townspeople began to take notice more fully. They saw Jed's quiet dedication, the care in his eyes, and the gentleness in his movements. Some of the neighbors began to come closer, offering small gifts, a basket of vegetables, a jar of honey, or a loaf of bread. Others stood at a distance, unsure of how to help, but inspired by what they were witnessing. The atmosphere of the town began to shift, from the usual self-interest and busyness to a quiet awareness that caring for one another mattered. Mary watched it all unfold with a mixture of wonder and humility. She had always been independent, proud of her ability to manage on her own, but now she realized that strength came not only from doing everything alone, but also from allowing kindness to reach her when she needed it most. Jed's presence was a quiet reminder that community mattered, that people could come together, and that the smallest acts of care could change lives. By late afternoon, Mary had rested, eaten, and even managed a small smile. Jed stepped back for a moment, surveying the scene. The blankets were arranged, the fire burned steadily, the food was within reach, and Mary looked more at ease than she had in weeks. He did not seek recognition. He simply wanted her to be safe and comfortable. The thought of the coming days did not worry him as much because he knew he could continue to help, and perhaps the town itself would begin to see the importance of compassion in their daily lives. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Mary finally spoke again. "Thank you, Jed," she said, her voice steady now, carrying gratitude that went beyond words. "I don't know what I would have done without you today." Jed smiled gently, his eyes soft but firm. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just stay safe, and we'll get through this together."
That evening, as Jed mounted his horse to ride back to his cabin, he looked back at Mary's porch and the little cabin that now seemed brighter, warmer, and safer than it had in days.
The town had witnessed something remarkable, even if only silently, and the small acts of kindness had begun to ripple outward in ways that no one could yet see. Mary waved to him softly, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than words could convey. Jed tipped his hat and rode off, his heart calm, knowing that the first step of helping someone in need had been taken, and that the next day, the story of care would continue to unfold. The next morning in the small frontier town began quietly, but with an unusual sense of anticipation in the air. The sun was just rising, spilling golden light over the dusty streets and casting long shadows behind the wooden cabins. Most of the townspeople were starting their daily routines, fetching water, feeding animals, and preparing their small homes for the day. But there was something different today. Whispers floated through the streets, carried on the soft morning breeze. People had seen Jedediah the day before, quietly helping Mary, and while some had initially dismissed it as a small act, the memory lingered, leaving a sense of curiosity and admiration in its wake. Mary had awakened earlier than usual. She felt a warmth and safety that she hadn't felt for days. The blankets Jed had laid out and the carefully stacked firewood near the stove made her cabin feel more like a home than it had in weeks. She took a deep breath, resting her hands on her growing belly, and felt a deep sense of relief. Yesterday had been hard. Her husband was away, supplies were low, and the cold nights seemed endless. But now, with Jed's quiet acts of kindness, she could breathe again. She smiled softly to herself, still amazed that someone she hardly knew had devoted so much time to helping her. Jedediah, meanwhile, had returned to his cabin after his early morning visit, but he could not stay still. His mind kept returning to Mary's cabin. The image of her resting peacefully, safe and warm, remained in his thoughts. He realized that helping her yesterday had been just the beginning. The day ahead promised new challenges. Supplies might run low. The weather could turn harsh, and Mary would need someone to guide her through the simple but necessary tasks of preparing for the baby's arrival. Jed was determined that she would not have to face these challenges alone. By mid-morning, the town began to notice a change in the way people moved about. Some neighbors who had watched Jed the previous day quietly began to approach Mary's cabin. They brought small gifts, a jar of preserved fruit, a bundle of firewood, or a loaf of bread. They didn't speak much at first, unsure of how to act, but their actions were meaningful. It was as if Jed's quiet dedication had awakened a sense of community in the town, encouraging others to help in their own small ways. Mary accepted these gifts with humility and gratitude, her heart lifting with each thoughtful gesture. She began to understand that the hardships of life could be shared and softened when people chose to care for one another. Jed watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction, but he did not allow it to distract him from his own work. He knew there was more to do. The small porch needed reinforcement to withstand any sudden gusts of wind, and the firewood supply needed to be organized so Mary could access it easily. He also planned to build a small makeshift shelter outside her cabin, using his strength and tools to ensure she had a safe place to sit or rest during the day. He moved carefully and deliberately, aware of his size and determined not to make a spectacle of his efforts. His goal was not recognition, but genuine care. By noon, Mary had prepared a light meal with the supplies Jed had brought. She sat wrapped in a warm blanket, her hands resting on her belly, as she nibbled on bread and fruit. Jed stood nearby, helping to adjust the fire so it would burn steadily without smoking too much. He noticed the little gestures Mary made, how she appreciated warmth, how she was careful not to waste food, and how her eyes lit up when she saw even the simplest act of kindness. It reminded him that life in the frontier was not just about survival, but about noticing the small things that made each day brighter. As the afternoon approached, Jed decided it was time to start on the shelter. He chose a spot just outside Mary's porch where the sun would provide warmth during the day, but the structure could also block the wind. He began gathering logs and sturdy branches, stacking them with care. His massive hands worked with surprising gentleness, arranging each piece so it would hold together firmly without causing any damage to the ground or the nearby cabin. Mary watched, fascinated, as the giant of a man moved with both strength and grace. She realized that Jed's size, which had seemed intimidating before, was now a source of comfort. Some townspeople began to linger nearby, unable to resist watching the unusual scene. Children whispered excitedly to one another, pointing at the giant cowboy who was building a shelter for a young woman. Some adults, initially skeptical, felt a tug at their hearts. They saw that kindness could be simple yet powerful. Even those who had never spoken to Jed before felt inspired. It was as if a quiet lesson in compassion was unfolding before their eyes, and they were witnesses to something rare and beautiful in their ordinary lives. Jed worked steadily through the day, pausing only to ensure Mary was comfortable and had everything she needed. He offered suggestions in a soft voice, explaining why certain placements of the logs and blankets would make the shelter stronger and more protective. Mary listened attentively, feeling a sense of safety she had not experienced in weeks. She realized that the combination of Jed's physical strength and his thoughtful care was more valuable than she could have imagined. The shelter began to take shape, a small but sturdy structure that promised warmth and protection against the elements. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the shelter was nearly complete. Jed stepped back and examined his work. It was simple, functional, and secure. Mary's cabin now had a space where she could rest during the day, protected from wind and weather. The firewood was stacked neatly, and the blankets were arranged so that she could wrap herself warmly at any moment. Mary looked at the shelter and then at Jed, her eyes welling with tears. She had never expected such care and thoughtfulness, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude that words could hardly express. Jed noticed the change in the atmosphere around them. The neighbors who had watched quietly now began to approach, offering additional help. One man brought more firewood, another carried fresh water from the well, and a young woman offered herbs that could be used for comfort during pregnancy. Jed accepted these gifts with quiet thanks, knowing that the combined effort of many small acts of kindness could make a profound difference. He felt a deep satisfaction in seeing the community slowly coming together, inspired by what had begun as a simple gesture of care. By late afternoon, Mary's cabin was transformed. What had been a place of vulnerability and solitude now felt warm, safe, and welcoming. The shelter outside stood firm, the fire burned steadily, and the supplies were carefully arranged. Mary felt an overwhelming sense of relief and security. For the first time in weeks, she felt that she could face the coming days with confidence, knowing that she was not alone. Jed had not only helped her with tangible needs, but had also restored her faith in human kindness. As the evening approached, Jed prepared to leave for his own cabin, but he paused to ensure Mary was comfortable. She wrapped herself in a blanket and smiled at him, a small gesture full of meaning. "Thank you, Jed," she said softly. "You've done more than I could have ever imagined." Jed tipped his hat and gave a quiet nod.
"You're welcome," he said.
"Just stay safe and rest. We'll get through this together." As he rode back to his cabin, Jed felt a sense of quiet pride. The day had been long and filled with effort, but the reward was worth every moment. Mary was safe. The town had witnessed an example of selfless care, and the small acts of kindness were beginning to ripple outward. He knew that the challenges were not over, but he also knew that when people chose to help one another, even in small ways, the world became a little brighter, a little warmer, and a little more hopeful. That night, the town slept with a new sense of calm. Mary rested comfortably in her cabin, surrounded by warmth and the knowledge that she was not alone. Jed returned to his cabin, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a day spent doing what was right. Outside, the stars shone brightly in the clear frontier sky, a reminder that even in the hardest of places, light could always be found. The morning dawned colder than usual, the kind of chill that cut through the thin walls of frontier cabins and made the wind feel sharper than it had any right to be. Mary awoke early as she had grown accustomed to doing. But this morning she felt something different. She sensed that today would not be ordinary. She rose carefully, adjusting the blankets around her, and looked out the window at the first glimmers of sunlight painting the sky in pale gold. Her cabin seemed warmer than before, safer, and the shelter Jed had built outside had held firm against the harsh wind overnight. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope bloom quietly in her chest. Jedediah was already awake, his massive form silhouetted against the rising sun as he moved around his cabin. He had prepared for the day the night before, thinking carefully about what Mary might need. He had noticed that the weather was colder than expected, and he knew that the day might bring challenges. There were still tasks to be done: securing more firewood, preparing the cabin for any sudden storms, and ensuring Mary had enough food and water until her husband returned. But Jed also felt an unusual sense of urgency this morning, as if something unseen was pushing him to act quickly and decisively. By mid-morning, Mary had stepped outside to check on the small shelter Jed had built. The wind whistled softly through the trees, and a few scattered clouds hinted at a possible storm later in the day. She looked around and noticed that some townspeople had gathered quietly at a distance. They did not speak, but their eyes followed Jed as he moved carefully around the porch, adjusting blankets, stacking firewood, and checking the stability of the small shelter. The sight of the quiet giant at work, so intent on caring for her, stirred emotions Mary had never fully recognized before. She realized that the people around her were watching more than Jed. They were witnessing a lesson in courage, kindness, and selflessness. Jedediah worked steadily, his every movement precise. He checked the shelter's support beams, rearranged blankets for maximum warmth, and moved baskets of food into places Mary could reach easily. With each careful adjustment, he displayed a combination of strength and gentleness that left even the most skeptical townspeople in awe. Some whispered quietly to one another, unable to contain their admiration. They had never seen such determination and care focused on a single person. Many of them were moved in ways they could not explain, inspired to think about how they could help others in their own lives. Mary approached Jed slowly, holding her hands over her belly. "Jed, you've already done so much," she said softly, worry mixed with gratitude. "I don't want to trouble you further." Jed turned to her, his eyes calm but serious. "You're not troubling me," he said gently. "It's important that you and the baby are safe. That's all that matters. We have to make sure nothing goes wrong no matter what today brings." The words carried a quiet power. Mary realized that Jed was not only thinking about today, but also about the days ahead, about the storms, about the night she might spend alone. His foresight and care made her heart swell with gratitude and relief. She nodded, unable to find more words, and stepped back to watch as he continued his work. As the day progressed, clouds began to gather in the sky, and the wind grew stronger. Jed could see the signs of an approaching storm, and he knew that the shelter would need extra reinforcement. He began moving larger logs, carefully securing the structure with ropes and additional supports. Mary watched, impressed by his strength and ingenuity. Each movement was deliberate, each action purposeful. He did not rush, but he worked with quiet urgency, aware that time was limited and the weather was unpredictable. Suddenly, a loud gust of wind swept across the town, rattling the windows and making the wooden cabins creak. Mary's heart skipped a beat as she clutched her belly instinctively. The townspeople gasped and whispered nervously. Jedediah did not flinch. He moved quickly to brace the shelter, planting his massive frame firmly against it to steady the structure. The wind howled around him, but he remained calm, his focus entirely on protecting Mary and the small space she relied on. The intensity of the moment drew the townspeople closer. Children peeked from behind fences. Women held their hands over their mouths in worry, and men stood silently, unable to believe the sight before them. Jed, the gentle giant, was holding the storm at bay with nothing but his strength, determination, and care. Mary watched in awe, tears pricking her eyes. She realized that this was more than protection from the wind. This was a gesture of unwavering courage, selflessness, and love that could not be measured by words alone. As the storm worsened, Jed quickly moved baskets of food and blankets into the cabin, ensuring that Mary would have everything she needed if the weather became more severe. And the wind howled like a wild animal outside, tossing dust and leaves through the streets. But inside the cabin and under the small shelter, Mary felt safe. Jed's presence was a shield, both physical and emotional. She could feel his calm determination, the kind that could face any challenge, and it strengthened her own courage. The storm continued to rage for several hours, and during that time, Jed never wavered. He remained at the shelter, occasionally adjusting logs, moving blankets, or ensuring the fire burned steadily. The townspeople watched in silent admiration. Some began to step forward, offering additional help, carrying more firewood, securing ropes, and helping to steady the shelter. The giant cowboy had inspired them to act, to put aside fear and hesitation, and to join in the effort to protect someone in need. Mary could hardly believe what she was witnessing. The town, often busy with its own struggles, was now united in a quiet, shared mission. Finally, as the storm began to subside, Jedediah stepped back and surveyed the work. The shelter had held firm. The fire had burned steadily. The supplies were secure, and Mary was safe and warm inside. A collective sigh of relief seemed to rise from the gathered townspeople who had watched the drama unfold with bated breath. Mary, tears flowing freely now, stood and stepped toward Jed. She reached out and touched his arm lightly. "Jed, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Jed smiled gently, shaking his head. "You don't have to," he said softly. "You're safe. That's enough." The townspeople, seeing the depth of Jed's care and the courage he had shown during the storm, could no longer remain silent. Many approached Mary to check on her and offer their own support. Children ran to fetch extra blankets, women offered warm drinks, and men carried additional firewood. The storm had passed, but its effect lingered in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the giant cowboy's selfless actions. The town, for a brief but unforgettable moment, felt closer, more connected, and more capable of kindness than ever before. Mary looked around at the people who had come together, her heart full. She realized that Jed had not only protected her physically, but had also inspired a transformation in the town itself. Where there had once been indifference, fear, or hesitation, there was now care, courage, and community. And at the center of it all stood Jedediah, the gentle giant whose quiet courage had touched everyone in ways that words could not fully capture. As the sun began to break through the clouds, painting the sky with warm colors, Mary finally spoke again. "Jed, you've done more than anyone could have imagined. You've protected me, cared for me, and inspired the town. I don't even know how to describe it." Jed placed a large, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just take care of yourself and the baby," he said simply. "That's all that matters. We'll face tomorrow together, like we did today." For Mary, that moment marked a turning point. She felt hope, gratitude, and a deep sense of safety for the first time in weeks. For the townspeople, it was a moment they would remember forever, the day they witnessed courage, kindness, and selflessness in action. And for Jed, it was a quiet affirmation that doing what was right, even when difficult, could change lives, strengthen communities, and bring warmth to even the coldest of frontier days. The storm had tested them all, but it had also revealed the true character of a man who had chosen to act with compassion when it mattered most. And in that, the whole town had witnessed something extraordinary, a story of courage and care that would be told for generations to come. The day after the storm dawned clear and bright. The sky was a deep, unbroken blue, and the morning sun spilled warmth across the dusty streets of the town. For Mary, it was a new beginning. She woke to find the small shelter that Jedediah had built still standing firm, the blankets arranged neatly, and the firewood carefully stacked. The night had been calm, and the quiet comfort she felt was more than physical. It was emotional, the feeling of safety and care that she had not experienced in weeks. Her hands rested over her belly, and she smiled softly. For the first time in a long while, she truly felt that everything would be okay. Jedediah arrived early, as he always did, carrying more supplies to ensure Mary's comfort. Today, he had decided to bring fresh water from the well, additional food, and some herbs that could be brewed into a calming tea. He moved with his usual quiet determination, carefully balancing the baskets in his large hands. He approached Mary's cabin without making a sound, gently placing the supplies near the porch. Mary looked up, her eyes meeting his, and smiled warmly. "You didn't have to come so early, Jed," she said softly. "You've already done so much for me." Jed shook his head, his calm expression unchanging.
"It's not too much," he said gently. "We have to make sure you're safe and comfortable."
"That's the most important thing right now." Mary nodded, feeling a deep gratitude she could hardly put into words. The storm yesterday had shown her not just Jed's strength, but his kindness, his patience, and his unwavering care. She realized that the world could be harsh, unpredictable, and even frightening, but there were people like Jed who could make life bearable, even beautiful, with their quiet courage. As the morning progressed, the townspeople began to gather around Mary's cabin. Word had spread about what had happened during the storm, and many wanted to see for themselves the man who had risked so much to protect a single woman. Children peeked from behind fences, adults carried small gifts, and neighbors whispered quietly among themselves. Jed did not seek attention, but his actions had inspired something in the town, a recognition that selfless kindness could change lives and strengthen a community. Mary stepped outside to greet them, holding a blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly, addressing the neighbors who had come to help. "Yesterday would have been much harder without all of you." The townspeople smiled and nodded, some shyly stepping forward to offer food, firewood, or other small tokens of care. Jed watched from the side, silently proud, but he did not intervene. This was the moment when the town itself began to participate in the kindness he had started. Slowly but surely, the community came together, moved by the example of one man who had acted out of compassion and courage. Throughout the day, Jed helped Mary organize her cabin further. He built small shelves for her food, repaired any loose boards on the walls, and arranged blankets and pillows so she could rest comfortably. Each action, while simple, was infused with thoughtfulness. Mary could see that Jed considered her needs carefully, thinking not just of immediate comfort, but also of the coming weeks and months. She realized that he understood what it meant to care for someone fully, without expecting anything in return. By afternoon, the town had gathered more fully. Neighbors helped to repair fences, carried water, and even prepared small meals to ensure that Mary would not have to struggle again while Samuel, her husband, was away. Children ran back and forth, delivering bundles of firewood and tidying the yard, giggling as they did so. The sight was heartwarming, a sign that Jed's single act of care had sparked a ripple of kindness throughout the community. Mary felt her heart swell with gratitude. She had always been independent, proud of her ability to manage on her own. But now she understood that accepting help was not weakness. It was a strength, a way to survive, thrive, and connect with others. Jed had taught her that by his example, not through words or lectures, but through steady, patient, and compassionate action. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Jed gathered the remaining supplies he had brought and prepared to leave for his own cabin. Mary approached him, her hands clasped together, and looked up at his towering frame. "Jed," she said softly, "I don't think I can ever thank you enough for what you've done. You've saved me and my baby, and you've inspired the whole town. Everyone is talking about your courage." Jed smiled gently, his eyes calm. "You don't need to thank me," he said simply. "I did what anyone should do. You're safe, and that's enough." Mary felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back.
"It's not just enough," she said quietly. "It's more than I could have ever imagined."
I will never forget it." Jed tipped his hat and turned toward his horse, which had been waiting patiently nearby. He climbed into the saddle with ease, his large frame fitting naturally against the horse. As he prepared to ride away, Mary watched him, feeling a mix of admiration, relief, and deep gratitude. The sun cast a warm glow on his broad shoulders, highlighting not only his physical strength, but the strength of his heart. The townspeople lingered nearby, many of them speaking quietly to one another about what they had witnessed. Some had initially doubted Jed's intentions, thinking perhaps he sought recognition or reward. But after the events of the past 2 days, those doubts were gone. They had seen true courage and selflessness in action, and it had touched them all deeply. It was a reminder that even in the toughest times, people could rise to the occasion and make a difference. Mary returned to her cabin, feeling a new sense of peace. She arranged the blankets and firewood, preparing for the evening, and took a moment to reflect on what had happened. The storm had tested her, but it had also revealed the kindness and strength of others. Jed's actions had not only protected her physically, but had also given her hope, confidence, and a sense of belonging. She realized that life in the frontier could be harsh, but moments of compassion could shine brighter than any hardship. As night fell, the town settled into a quiet calm. Mary sat by the fire, sipping a warm cup of tea, and thought about Jed. She wondered how one man, with quiet courage and a gentle heart, could inspire so much change. She knew that the story of his actions would not be forgotten, not just in her heart, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. The town had learned that kindness could be contagious, that courage could be quiet, and that even the simplest acts of care could ripple outward to touch many lives. Jed returned to his cabin, tired but content. He fed Clara, his horse, and then sat quietly by his own fire, reflecting on the past 2 days. He thought about Mary, the storm, and the townspeople who had come together. He felt no pride in the way others might, no desire for recognition or thanks. Instead, he felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing that you have done what is right. That sense of fulfillment was stronger than any praise or reward he could receive. Over the next few days, life in the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed. Neighbors who had once ignored each other began to greet one another warmly. People offered small acts of help and kindness to friends and strangers alike. Mary continued to recover from the stress of her husband's absence, feeling safe and supported. The story of Jedediah's courage during the storm became a quiet legend in the town, a reminder that one person's care and determination could spark hope and inspire others. Mary often thought of Jed, not just as the giant man who had protected her, but as a symbol of what it meant to be human. Strong, compassionate, and willing to act when others were in need. And though he remained modest and quiet, working his land and helping the town in small, unseen ways. Everyone who knew the story understood that his actions had made a difference that would last far beyond the frontier town. Time passed and Mary's husband returned safely from his journey. He was amazed to hear the story of what Jed had done, and he too felt deep gratitude and admiration. Mary welcomed him home with relief, and together they settled back into life in the town, strengthened by the experience and the knowledge that they were not alone. The shelter remained, the blankets and firewood were replenished, and the story of Jed's courage became part of the town's history, a tale of kindness, bravery, and the power of one person to inspire many. Years later, children who grew up in the town would hear the story of Jedediah and the pregnant woman he protected during the storm. They would listen with wide eyes and full hearts, learning that courage and kindness often come quietly, without fanfare, and that a single act of selflessness can change the lives of many. Mary would tell them, her voice steady and warm, about the gentle giant who had saved her, comforted her, and inspired an entire town to care for one another. And Jed, in his quiet way, would continue his life, helping others whenever needed, leaving behind a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of humanity, compassion, and love. The morning after the storm was calm, the kind of stillness that felt almost sacred. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, and the sun slowly warmed the dusty streets of the small frontier town. For Mary, waking up today felt different. There was a quiet peace in the air, a sense of safety and warmth that had not been hers for many long weeks. The shelter Jedediah had built outside her cabin was still standing firm, and the blankets and firewood were neatly arranged just as he had left them. The thought that she was truly protected, not just from the elements, but from the hardships that had weighed on her heart, made her chest feel lighter than it had in months. Mary rose carefully, adjusting the blankets around her shoulders. She moved slowly, mindful of her growing belly, and stepped outside to breathe in the crisp morning air. The wind was gentle, a welcome contrast to the harsh gusts of yesterday's storm. She looked toward the shelter, noting how sturdy it had remained despite the wind and rain. Her eyes swept over the small town, the homes, the fences, and the streets that were beginning to fill with the quiet bustle of early morning activity. Everything seemed brighter, almost as if the storm had washed away more than just dust and leaves. Jedediah arrived soon after, carrying more supplies to ensure Mary's comfort. Today he brought a small basket of fresh bread, a few bottles of milk, and some herbs that could be brewed into tea to soothe her. He moved carefully, balancing the items in his large hands as if they were delicate treasures. His eyes scanned the ground for any obstacles, and his steps were slow and deliberate so that nothing would spill or be disturbed. When he reached the cabin, he knelt slightly to place the basket near the porch, careful not to startle Mary. Mary watched him, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Jed," she said softly, "you really didn't have to bring all this again. You've already done more than anyone could imagine." Jed shook his head, his expression calm and kind. "It's not too much," he said gently. "We have to make sure you're safe and comfortable. That's the most important thing." "Nothing else matters right now," Mary nodded, realizing that he was right. Yesterday's storm had been a harsh reminder of how vulnerable life could be, and Jed's constant care had made her feel protected in a way she had never experienced. She felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief and gratitude. Jed's presence had not only ensured her safety, but it also brought her hope, courage, and a sense of belonging. By mid-morning, some townspeople had begun to gather quietly near Mary's cabin. Word of Jedediah's selfless acts during the storm had spread, and many were curious to see the man who had protected a single woman from nature's wrath. They watched from a distance at first, unsure if they should intrude. Children peeked out from behind fences, giggling softly, while adults whispered quietly to one another, their eyes fixed on Jed's strong, careful movements. Jed, however, remained focused on his task, moving deliberately to organize the supplies, reinforce the shelter, and ensure Mary's comfort. Mary stepped out to greet the neighbors, wrapping herself in a warm blanket. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "Yesterday would have been much harder without all of your help." The townspeople smiled, some shyly approaching with small gifts. One carried a basket of fresh vegetables, another a loaf of bread, while a young woman brought herbs that could be used for comfort. Even though each gift was simple, Mary felt her heart swell with gratitude. She realized that kindness could be small yet powerful, and that a community could become stronger simply by noticing and caring for one another. Jedediah moved quietly among them, assisting with organizing supplies and helping to carry heavier items to the cabin and the shelter. His large hands moved with remarkable gentleness, lifting, stacking, and arranging without ever making a sound of strain. The townspeople watched in awe, impressed by the combination of his strength and his care. Each action he took demonstrated thoughtfulness and attention to detail, showing that true strength was not just physical, but also emotional and moral. As the day continued, Mary began to help in small ways. She organized the food and blankets, prepared a warm drink, and made sure the children who had come to assist were safe. Though she had been proud of her independence before, she now realized that accepting help was not weakness. It was a strength, a way to survive and thrive when faced with life's challenges. She felt a deep connection to the people around her, understanding that their collective care could lighten burdens and make life more bearable. By afternoon, Jedediah decided to reinforce the shelter one final time. He checked each beam, adjusted the blankets, and made sure that Mary would be protected not just from the wind, but from any unexpected weather in the coming days. Mary watched, marveling at his care and focus. She could see the patience in his movements, the quiet thoughtfulness that guided every action. Jed's work was more than just physical labor. It was a demonstration of love, compassion, and selflessness. The townspeople had gathered more fully now, inspired by what they had witnessed. They began to take part in small ways, some carrying firewood, others helping to adjust the blankets, and a few even offering to repair small parts of the cabin that had been weakened by the storm. Mary felt her heart fill with warmth. Jed's courage and care had sparked something larger than just protection for her. It had brought the town together. The experience had reminded everyone that kindness, courage, and compassion were contagious, capable of spreading quietly from one person to many. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Jedediah prepared to leave. Mary approached him, holding her hands over her belly and looking up at him with gratitude. "Jed, I don't know how to ever thank you enough," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've not only saved me and the baby, but you've also inspired the whole town. Everyone is talking about your courage." Jed smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly.
I did what anyone should do. You're safe now, and that's all that matters.
Mary felt tears well up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She realized that Jed's actions were about more than safety or comfort. They were about hope, about showing that even in the hardest times, there were people willing to act with courage and care. She knew that she would carry the memory of his kindness with her for the rest of her life. Jed mounted his horse, Clara, and looked back at Mary's cabin. The sun's last rays caught the edges of his broad shoulders, casting long shadows across the ground. He tipped his hat to her, a quiet gesture full of meaning, and rode toward his own cabin, leaving behind not just safety and comfort, but a legacy of kindness that would ripple through the town for years to come. The townspeople lingered for a while, speaking quietly among themselves about what they had witnessed. Some admitted they had doubted Jed's intentions at first, thinking perhaps he sought recognition or reward. But after seeing his actions, calm, deliberate, and selfless, they knew he had acted purely out of care and courage. The experience had left them inspired, showing them that a single person's kindness could create change far beyond what seemed possible. Mary returned to her cabin, arranging blankets and firewood, reflecting on the past days. The storm had tested her, revealing her vulnerabilities, but it had also shown her the strength of human compassion. She felt gratitude not just for Jed, but for the community that had begun to come together. She realized that life in the frontier was hard, but moments of care and courage could make it brighter, safer, and full of hope. Her husband, Samuel, returned safely a few days later. He was amazed to hear the story of what Jed had done and the way the town had rallied around Mary. He embraced her tightly, grateful for her safety and deeply moved by the quiet heroism of Jedediah. Together, Mary and Samuel settled back into life, strengthened by the experience and the knowledge that they were never truly alone. The shelter remained, the firewood was replenished, and the story of Jed's courage became a lasting tale in the town, a story of compassion, bravery, and the power of one person to inspire many. Years later, children in the town would hear the story of Jedediah and the pregnant woman he had protected during the storm. They would listen with wide eyes and full hearts, learning that courage and kindness often come quietly, without fanfare, and that even the smallest acts of selflessness could ripple outward to touch many lives. Mary would tell them her story, speaking of the giant cowboy whose quiet strength and gentle heart had saved her and inspired an entire town. And Jed, in his modest way, continued his life, helping others quietly whenever needed, leaving behind a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of humanity, courage, and love.